Climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It is shaping up to be one of the most defining geopolitical challenges of the 21st century. Did you know that the last 8 years have been the hottest on record globally? As global temperatures rise, so does the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events like droughts, floods, and hurricanes. All of this is disrupting communities and countries around the world. Climate change threatens to redraw coastlines, alter ecosystems, and trigger mass migration, with profound geopolitical implications. How will climate change impact global divisions of power and international relations in the coming decades? Which nations stand to gain or lose influence in a climate-disrupted world? These are critical questions that will decide the geopolitical landscape of the future. In this video, we will analyze the geopolitical consequences of climate change across 3 core areas. First, the economic impacts for nations, which stand to gain or lose from the shifting energy landscape and trade routes. Second, the security challenges it poses, including resource conflicts over water and food scarcity. And third, the shifting balance of power given vulnerability differences between nations. Let's dive in and understand the complex geopolitics shaping up around climate change. Climate change is triggering a seismic shift in the global energy system and trade flows. As the world transitions away from fossil fuels, some oil-producing countries stand to lose influence, while renewable energy superpowers will gain sway. For instance, climate policies and carbon taxes could trigger a drop in demand for oil and gas, commodities that currently empower exporters like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. A greener global economy spells trouble for these fossil fuel-dependent regimes. In contrast, countries dominating green technologies like solar, wind, batteries, and electric vehicles are poised to bolster their economic and political standing. For example, China already controls over 70% of global solar panel production and over 60% of lithium-ion battery production capacity. Its emphasis on dominating renewable energy tech gives it an edge. Climate change also promises to rewrite global trade flows and access to resources. As the planet warms, new shipping routes are opening up in the Arctic. This is especially significant for Russia. Their northern coastline is now more accessible, holding the promise of more maritime trade, energy, and minerals. In essence, climate shifts can elevate some countries as winners, while deteriorating the position of other fossil fuel-rich nations, altering the global distribution of wealth and influence. Now let's move on to the unprecedented security challenges unleashed by a warming planet. Climate change is poised to become a threat multiplier, exacerbating risks such as food and water scarcity, infectious disease, natural disasters, and migration. When such stresses combine with existing social tensions, they can drive instability within nations and heighten disputes between nations. For example, research suggests that Syria's civil war was exacerbated by the worst drought in 900 years which preceded the conflict. Climate stresses intensified grievances that boiled over into an outbreak of violence. Similar dynamics exist across regions like the Middle East and North Africa where droughts are fueling migration. Speaking of migration, climate change may drive over 140 million people in just 3 regions, Latin America, South Asia, and Africa, to move within their countries by 2050. This mass displacement threatens to heighten domestic and international tensions. Climate change may imperil global crop yields and fish stocks. This worsens risks of hunger and malnutrition. Feeding the world's growing population will become harder as heat waves, floods and droughts threaten harvests and food transport. Scarce food can inflame civil conflicts and drive desperate populations to migrate. For instance, prolonged drought in Central America has hurt crop yields and cattle farming, displacing Hondurans who then migrate north. Climate stresses combined with misgovernance can breed violent extremism. Groups like Boko Haram and ISIS have recruited people whose livelihoods were ravaged by environmental degradation. People with limited economic opportunities are more vulnerable to recruitment by such extremist groups. When you combine environmental stresses with existing ethnic tensions and weak institutions, it creates a perfect storm for internal conflicts. We may see such climate wars become more frequent as nations struggle with more climate refugees and diminished resources. In essence, climate change is primed to impose unprecedented pressures that can spill across borders and destabilize entire regions if not handled adroitly. This brings us to the third dimension: how climate change may disrupt the global balance of power. The risks countries face from climate impacts vary sharply, altering their relative power positions. Small island states face an existential crisis from rising seas inundating their heavily populated coastal cities and villages. Entire cultures tied to island ecosystems may vanish. Meanwhile, coastal megacities also face huge climate risks, but have more resources to adapt. Among large nations, developing countries in tropical latitudes like India, Brazil and Nigeria are particularly vulnerable to extreme heat waves, droughts and ensuing food shortages. Poor infrastructure exacerbates their inability to cope with climate disruptions. In contrast, developed northern nations like the US, Canada, Germany and Scandinavia have greater economic resources and technological prowess to manage climate risks. Their geographies also give them an adaptive advantage. However, even for rich nations, the climate bill will be heavy. For instance, America faces tens of billions of dollars in damages annually from intensified hurricanes, floods and wildfires. Climate change may tax economic bandwidth and military capabilities as more disasters strike home. Now let's consider the big picture in terms of global power. The nation most threatened by climate change is the world's dominant superpower, the United States. Sea level rise threatens America's costly coastal infrastructure. Inland, worsening droughts, heat waves and floods may strain water resources in agricultural and populated areas. On the other hand, America's prime challenger for the superpower mantle, China, faces lower climate risks due to its geography, even though some heavily populated coastal regions are threatened. Beijing's authoritarian system also allows it to marshal enormous resources towards climate adaptation and green technology domination. In effect, climate change blunts America's edge over China in terms of resilience. It imposes higher relative costs on Washington, potentially constraining their global leadership and projection of power abroad. The climate crisis appears poised to erode America's superpower status relative to a less exposed China. In an interconnected world, climate impacts will inevitably spill over as cross-border challenges. The fossil-fueled era birthed today's global order and distribution of power. Now, the green energy transition promises to give birth to a new world order where power is redistributed among nations. Cooperation and justice will be critical to handle complex transnational issues like mass migration and prevent conflict. Technology sharing and climate financing for poorer nations can also help mitigate instability. There are no easy solutions, but fostering solidarity and rejecting xenophobia will be key. The geopolitical implications of climate change will likely intensify as impacts grow. But this crisis also represents an opportunity to reinvent flawed systems and create a more equitable world if we work together. Our shared climate fate may just bring humanity closer. Thank you for watching. Do like this video and subscribe to our channel for more insights on geopolitics, history and environment. Until next time.